Hi there. Welcome back to Metropolis. I'm your host, Colton Datsampa, and I'm talking to you differently, smoothly, because you might have anxiety, eco anxiety, also regular anxiety, but I can't really help with that on today's episode. On today's episode, we're going to try and deal with that eco anxiety. What's eco anxiety? Well, something some activists might be feeling, environmental activists who feel like things aren't really getting better and that climate crises just keep piling on, forming a significant part of the polycrisis, some might call it. So I know sometimes I have eco anxiety, and I think, what can we do? Where can we find hope? Well, today's guest, here to help with that, eco anxiety. Our guest today, Alex Pace, PhD candidate, public scholar at Concordia, studier of tree rings. Thank you for coming on, Alex.
Thank you, Colin.
Do you ever get climate anxiety, eco anxiety?
Yeah, definitely. But I do feel like my eco anxiety has reduced over the course of my graduate studies.
Wow. I feel like usually the graduate studies makes people more stressed.
In some ways, yeah, but and just as I've learned more about climate action and everything that's been done, and also about past climate, which is what I study through tree rings, I feel a bit more hopeful because there's less left to my imagination. There's more that I know. So the worst case scenarios don't simmer and sort of boil to the top.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I could imagine scenarios where we get out of this, where we get past the worst impacts of climate change, or we avoid the worst impacts of climate change, rather.
Right. Yeah, I think so I have you on today because I attended a panel of yours called Montreal, a Climate Haven? And I think it left me with a lot of interesting ideas. This idea of a climate haven, like as you stated in the panel, it's sort of like contentious, but there's still something I think valuable there in that kind of concept. But before we get into that, you mentioned it a little bit, right, where you talked about what your research is. You study tree rings to figure out the past climate. Can you talk a bit about that research?
Yeah, so trees put on a ring every year in seasonal climates, and those rings record the environmental conditions in which they grew, potentially. So what we do as tree ring researchers is we find sites where trees are very sensitive to certain parts of ecology, of parts of the climate, and then we study that to give us context to the changes we're seeing today. And this is a sort of information through tree rings, through ice cores from the ice sheets, both at the tops of the highest mountains and on the polar ice caps, coral reefs, stalagmites. There's plenty of ways that we could understand the past conditions, and these are the things that make us understand, hey, we've had a certain climate paradigm for even like the past 800,000 years. There's been some sort of stability. There's cycles, of course, there's ice ages and all that, but we've stayed within a certain paradigm, and we're shifting things outside of that paradigm. So we're going into an environment that hasn't existed in pretty much 800,000 years. So the amount of carbon we have in the atmosphere, it hasn't been at this level in a really long time. And so we know that because of these different natural archives of past conditions, and tree rings are one of them. And that's what I study specifically for central southern Quebec, and giving us context. Okay, how has the environment changed over the past 1,000 years, and how does that fit into what we're projecting for climate change in this area?
Incredible.
And sort of filling in this network on Eastern North America, but North America in general, and the world, of all of these different archives to give us as much detail and much resolution as possible as to what the climate and what the environment used to be like.
No, I think of resolutions is interesting, right? Because like you talk about people taking ice cores, right? So that gives us a picture up north in the Arctic.
Well, not only that, because in the ice cores there's little bubbles of trapped air, and so that's how we know the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere
Oh wow.
in the past is through the bubbles in the ice core, and you could actually see the layering every year in an ice core, and so you could literally count back thousands of years and look at a specific layer and see, okay, the amount of carbon dioxide at that time was this amount.
Oh wow, interesting. Wow, you get just a perfect sample then. Of
Yeah,
that.
yeah. And so they actually just a few weeks ago they were able to go 1.2 million years into the past. They haven't released a study yet, but they were able to date it to that extent. So there's going to be new data coming out too. But we also have enough data to understand that, hey, we're going outside of the normal paradigm, and that's why the alarms went off.
When they did, yeah.
Yeah, alarms went off like the climate change is a big issue.
And I guess this kind of stuff is just further corroborates that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, climate has always changed, and that's a typical argument of climate deniers. But it's really about, hey, we've developed civilization in the past few thousand years within these certain conditions. And the planet has survived with much different environmental conditions. Like life on the planet survived. In the Arctic, in the Antarctic, you could find fossils of tropical plants from millions of years ago when the conditions were so that there were pretty much no ice caps. And I mean, everything was different back then, so it's not a great analog to now, but just things have changed a lot over the time span, but it's just happening very quickly. And civilization was built within a certain climate paradigm that we're shifting out of now.
Interesting. Well, let's get to the topic of this panel discussion.
Yeah.
Climate havens. Is Montreal a climate haven? That was one of the questions you're asking. But before we get into that, let's I need you to tell me, what is a climate haven? Is it like a nice beach with good weather? I'm on a lounge chair tanning. Is that a climate haven?
Well, yeah. I mean, technically that would be climate haven. But when we talk about climate havens, it's this concept of regions or cities are just areas on the planet that will be safer from the most dangerous impacts of climate change. And this is a subject that's only really come up, let's say, in the past decade, and especially more recently as places that were determined to be climate havens. So places that you won't necessarily get wildfires, or places where flooding isn't as much as an issue, or getting hit by hurricanes isn't as much of an issue, or sea level rise. So all these things that...
Like sweet spots.
Yeah, sweet spots where you could move. The idea is it's these places that you can build your life and not have to worry about having to move because of climate change. Because that is something that I think is like a survey said like 30 to 40% of Americans consider climate change when determining where to move. So
yeah. I mean, it makes sense, right? I remember like I'm trying to remember like those early like flood maps that were coming out. This is kind of like Inconvenient Truth days, like when they were showing like how much the planet could flood by if like ice caps were melting, specifically ice over land. I remember like a lot of these maps had just Florida like almost completely inundated, right? And it's like the question is like, where are they gonna go? And I guess that question is of course still on people's minds. And so what are some places that are climate havens? Like what are some examples?
So the term is controversial because at some point in the past few years there were a lot of articles with kind of a list of these different places in America specifically, because it was an American professor that determined these climate havens. That on this list, on the top of a lot of these lists, was Asheville, North Carolina. And so that became sort of a reason both for the city, all these cities that were on the list to sort of attract people to come to their cities. And then it so happens that Asheville got hit by an unprecedented hurricane event in October, intense flooding, billions of dollars of destruction, I believe. Yeah. And so then people were a bunch of media articles came out saying, hey, this was supposed to be the climate haven, and it just got completely destroyed by a climate event. And so then there's a lot of discussion of, are climate havens even real? Are they just a real estate concept that is used to market a certain city to attract people to it, but it's not actually based on any science? And that's true in a lot of cases, because you see that for Asheville. You also see it for Burlington, which was determined to be a climate haven, but
Vermont,
but got a huge amount of flooding a few years ago that also put that label into question. But then there's still plenty of areas that are on those lists, especially around the Great Lakes, that are arguably a safer place from the worst impacts of climate change when you think of drought, when you think of heat waves. Because when you're near a huge body of water, especially a lake, it regulates the temperature because that water absorbs the heat from the atmosphere, and it adds moisture as well. That does create a buffer so that these places are
a little better off.
Yeah, a little better off. And so that the part of the reason I wanted to do this event was, a lot of these lists were talking just about American cities, but in my mind, I'm thinking, is Montreal a climate haven? Will we be safer from some of the worst impacts? But of course, a lot of Montrealers have experienced an increasing heat waves.
Right. Yeah.
The smoke from the wildfires in 2023 that really opened a lot of people's eyes of, hey,
it can happen to us.
Yeah, it could happen to us. And so I brought together a couple professors and somebody from the city of Montreal, Sidney Ribaud, who is the director of the Office of Ecological Transition of Montreal. And I just wanted that discussion to happen of, where does Montreal fit into this idea of climate havens? Because I'm also part of a climate emergency committee at Concordia, and I do think we need to sort of shift the narrative with climate activism in a way, because for the longest time it was just about alarming people.
Right.
Because, I mean, obviously this is a huge issue and it needs to be...
Wake up.
Yeah, wake up.
Yeah, do something.
And so from like 2000 on until even now, in a lot of ways, there's that alarm narrative. But to me now, most people know about the issue if whether they believe in it or not. There's a lot of climate denialism, especially in the U.S., which percolates into Canada in ways as well. But
of course, yeah, but it definitely feels like that. I feel like that used to be the main argument, is happening or not. But it seems like now, like most of the public just seem to agree that it is happening, right?
Yeah. I feel like the alarms are often, a lot of politicians, I mean, less so now, especially after COVID, but because of all the different issues that have come from that, a lot of people are more concerned with like everyday things like paying rent and food prices. And so I feel like it has taken the back burner a bit, but politically, municipally and provincially, and for states, of course, when you look federally, especially in the U.S., it seems a bit more, obviously Trump doesn't believe in climate change, but there's a lot of, it's become an important narrative within politics so the alarm has been raised. So for me, I'm like, everybody's panicking about it, and I've done a lot of presentations in front of young people. Like, I don't think it's useful if you already know it's a problem. Like, that alarm narrative, I don't think is useful for a lot of people. We sort of need to cultivate, hey, these are the solutions.
Something pragmatic.
Yeah, these are solutions. These are things to be hopeful about. These are things to be critical about. And I think it's important to find the places that are safer from climate change, because by the end of the century, I think a lot of people will be moving because of climate. And it's already an issue for a lot of people moving to certain places because of the climate. And so I just wanted to prompt that discussion and see how Montreal fits into the picture.
Nice. No, it's always a good thing, I think, to keep things sort of pragmatic, because there's a certain point where like the alarmist stuff, it just stops like being productive, right?
Yeah, it's paralyzing too. Like, if you have a lot of eco anxiety and then it just keeps piling on, you just sort of give up. It's oh, this is hopeless. But that is counterproductive. That just, if we have all this energy and these potential people that could either do some sort of climate action or also help push the narrative of the solutions. If those people are paralyzed and are not really have the energy to do that, then we're actually losing a lot of power. And so that's the argument I take as to why we should shift the narrative to something that's more solutions oriented. And I do see that a lot in general. It's not like just me, but a lot of different sources are also trying to drive more of this solutions oriented discussion at this point.
Incredible. So tell me a bit about the panel then. What this panel of experts, someone from the city, what were their takes? What seemed to be a consensus, if there was any?
Yeah, well, Montreal is really quite advanced when it comes to climate action. I mean, we're lucky enough that our municipal politicians take climate change as a pretty serious issue and environmental issues quite seriously. And that's very inspiring for me to see that at a local level. And so they've released this climate action plan. I mean, Montreal plans to be carbon neutral by 2050. So that means we're absorbing as much carbon as we are releasing. So we're not adding any more of this gas that heats our atmosphere. And I mean, it's not just carbon. There's also methane and nitrous oxide. There's other
greenhouse gases.
Yeah, greenhouse gases, exactly. And so the goal of a lot of places is by 2050, this international consensus, we're aiming to be carbon neutral by 2050. And so that takes a lot of initiative. It takes a lot of planning. And so Montreal has released this plan to, they only look to 2030 mostly because it's just better that way especially at the scale of
50-year plan.
Or until municipal politics. Yeah. And so they released an update in 2023 data, and which is quite brave of them because, I mean, a lot of these issues take a longer time than 3 years to deal with. And the plan, I mean, the municipality has a lot of power to do certain things. That's something that came from the panel as well. So Sidney Ribault, he talked about how much power municipality has to change things, whether it be in transportation or buildings. I mean, buildings is a big issue in Montreal because something that's great about our province is the renewable electricity. Of course, there's issues with hydroelectricity ethically, especially when it comes to Indigenous issues. But the fact that we're 100% renewable in our electricity puts us ahead of a lot of cities in North America and allows us to focus on what are the next steps after we get our electricity renewable. So where are these other emissions coming from? One of the main ones is transportation. That's a really difficult thing to change. I mean, people invest in cars and so you're pushing against this huge machine, literally.
It kind of reminds you of I've seen I think some commentators in the States talk about this issue of having electric cars when the source of their power is still coal, right? It's of course you might be removing yourself from whatever kind of daily or weekly carbon emission production with your car, but then if all the energy for all these electric cars are still coming from coal, then what's the offset, really?
Right. Yeah, and that is often an argument against electric cars. It bothers me a bit. Obviously, car culture, ideally we want to reduce the amount of cars, and because of course there's people argue personal liberty and being able to use cars to go on with their lives, but we can't really create more highways in the city. We have to reduce the amount of cars for the sake of the planet, for the sake of air pollution, for the sake of reducing traffic, quality of life. And yeah, like you were saying, there is the issue of some places. I mean, you go to charge your car and it's getting charged by a coal power plant. So,
but not the case here.
Not the case here. And even when it is charged by coal power plants, that's the only time you're going slightly above the lifetime emissions of a gasoline car. Because when you create an electric car, there's a lot more emissions because of the batteries. The batteries really
lithium ion batteries.
Yeah, so you're right at the get-go when you get an electric vehicle, you actually have there's a more of a carbon footprint. But as you go over time, if you're not getting powered by a coal power plant, you're going to eventually have much less emissions than a gasoline car if you have an electric car. And there's also the argument, even if you're getting powered by coal, locally the air pollution is going to be much less because the tailpipe emission isn't happening.
Right.
And you could potentially capture some of the emissions directly from the coal power plant. And so air pollution is horrible for our health. It lowers IQ, it causes heart disease. There's plenty of reasons we don't want air pollution around. So even in the case where it's charged by a coal power plant, there is a bit of an argument. Okay, you're still doing something positive.
Right. It's still net positive. Yeah. Overall.
Yeah.
Okay. Sure.
Well, yeah, arguably, but still, we'd want to reduce the amount of coal power plants. That's like one of the main.
I interrupted you before though, so you're talking about how in Quebec here we have the benefit of not really having to rely on this massive like coal power plants like somewhere in Germany or China. But I'm kind of wondering, what do these panelists, where do they want to target? Like what's targeted first in Montreal for something to create Montreal to make it a climate haven of sorts?
Yeah. So part of what with my research and discussions about climate haven is there's geographical aspects to it. And I mean, on the panel, we have a climate scientist who talked about that. Montreal is advantageous geographically. I mean, we are in a place that will have issues with flooding, with heat waves, and potentially wildfire smoke. But I mean, drought it's also an issue, but all these issues can be much worse in other places. So geographically, we're in a
little better off.
Yeah, we're a little better off. We're not going to be affected by sea level change. So that's important to keep in mind. And then when it comes to Montreal politically, like a climate haven is also a place we build. It's a resilience that is achieved by making certain policy decisions and changing our built environment. So in general, cities, we call them urban heat islands because all of the asphalt and cement absorbs a lot more heat than if there was a bunch of plants and like a forest, for example, will be several degrees cooler than a city that's right beside it. And so there's a bunch of different things we could do to reduce urban heat islands. One of the best things is planting a bunch of trees, which is part of the Montreal Climate Action Plan. I don't remember the exact number, but I mean, they've planted millions of trees and will continue.
To reduce the overall heat.
Yeah, well, obviously, everybody's experience when on a hot day, you go under a tree, it's a lot cooler than the surrounding area or being directly in the sun. So at a city scale, the more trees you have is going to reduce the heat. And so then that reduces the impact of heat waves. And so that feeds into this idea, climate havens are places we build. And what's great about Montreal is we have these plans to build this resilience and they're happening. And having that political initiative is just something inspiring as well. And like you said, are you asked what sort of things do we tackle if we already have renewable electricity? There's buildings, so a lot of our buildings are heated by natural gas. So a big initiative, both municipally, but even at Concordia University, where we are right now, is to reduce the emissions of our buildings because they're heated by natural gas. And there are solutions to this. There's heat pumps, they're called, and basically they are a much more efficient way to heat a building. They use electricity instead of natural gas. So that's one of sort of the low-hanging fruit of a place like Montreal where we're already renewable electricity, and we could pioneer in a way because we could focus on things beyond renewable electricity, which is the main issue for a lot of cities in North America.
We're already a step ahead in that regard.
Yeah, we're already a step ahead. And so what Montreal is doing is sort of setting the pace for a lot of other places. And something that Sidney Ribault mentioned was that him and his team were able to convince the city to change these regulations so that all new buildings and old buildings as well will become carbon neutral. So their heating will be provided by heat pumps. And there was a lot of hesitation around that. And it turns out the province, after seeing Montreal implement it and seeing that there wasn't really any pushback from anybody, really, surprisingly, they're setting up regulations to do that province wide now.
Oh wow!
And
So the Montreal example, because they saw that it was feasible, that it was kind of popular, even they decided to take that up to a whole provincial level.
Yeah,
That's incredible.
Yeah, and I mean there's something that's interesting about Quebec in general is the sort of sovereignty and like the independence aspect, and so any way that we can sort of have energy independence is picked up by any part of the political spectrum, which is because renewable electricity tends to be associated with more like left-wing politicians, but even here the right-wing politicians are like, oh, having our own power is obviously a good thing.
Right, it's a thing of like sovereignty. It's a thing of like the nation.
And so natural gas, if we could reduce our dependence on natural gas, then that has the whole sovereignty aspect to it as well. Like we're producing all of our own electricity.
And there's like a thing there about like eco-nationalism that I think is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Right. This idea that like, of course, we want like, I feel like the old kind of like stalwart industries of nationalism is always like steel, coal. Like, I mean, when I think about historically, it's always been those kinds of like big industries that have supported nationalism. But it's interesting thinking about it in this Quebec context, where instead it's been something like the nationalism has come from like hydro. Of course, not just saying it's only from hydro. Of course, there's like the whole history of sovereignty here in the independence movie. But it's interesting that there's an aspect of it that is sort of environmentally tinged, right? Where like I don't think you would have that kind of eco-nationalism in somewhere like Alberta, or like Texas, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Fascinating. What did you leave this panel feeling hopeful? How's the audience reaction to this? Any good questions?
Yeah. Well, I got a couple comments saying that people felt more hopeful after this because we don't really a lot of these subjects, like people care about the environment and climate change, but about the details, there's a lot of people don't know about the details, and that's part of the reason I did the panel. Is like, what could we learn and spread about what Montreal is doing, and it's hopeful because you see that Montreal is doing a lot, and that there's a lot of progress to be made, and that there's challenges, like for transportation, for example, it's hard. Our biggest category of emissions is from transportation now because of, I mean, the electric, we have the biggest, I'm pretty sure we have the biggest electric vehicle charging station fleet in North America.
Like the network of where you could charge.
The network. And I think we have one of the highest proportions of electric vehicles in North America as well. But I do feel hopeful in that we are making a lot of progress, but again, transportation is an example where it's really challenging. So some of their targets for 2030, Montreal's targets is to reduce the amount of vehicles. And I mean, I think it's been reduced by like 0.6%, and their target is like 25%.
And they still have just 5 years for that then?
Yeah, they still have only have 5 years. And it's good to set ambitious targets. Like I'd be very surprised if they hit those targets, because people have make investments in cars, and so it's hard to switch people's habits they're trying to encourage car sharing, for example.
With Camino Tours.
Well, Camino Tours is also a great example of Montreal pioneering like car sharing services. In Montreal, Camino Tours has been exported to I think they're in France now as well, and things like Bixi. That
bike sharing service.
Yeah, bike sharing service. Like these sharing services are super important, because not everybody, for example, having a car can be useful in a lot of situations, but not everybody should be forced to buy a car if they want to have the convenience of a car in some time. So
there's other ways to have access to a car that's not just outright owning on.
Yeah. And so Camino Tours is a great example of that. They've been super successful. I mean, they have thousands and thousands of cars in Montreal now, and it's a great service. And so it's another example of Montreal sort of being a pioneer of both Bixi. It's used in New York now.
Every time I go to New York, I'm always telling my friends, I'm like, you guys got these city bikes from us.
It's true. And that's what's so beautiful about Montreal.
Keep talking.
Is that we have the opportunity to be pioneers in that way.
Incredible things. So you're telling me the. Oh, let me get comfortable here. Sorry about that, folks. The poster fell. So you're telling me our biggest source of emissions here in Montreal is transportation. So that includes like cars. And so if I'm trying to wonder, like, how would you expect the city to get to that like 25% target of like reduction?
Yeah. Well, I've had this argument with like family members of the bike. I mean, bike lanes are such a contentious issue.
Yeah.
I really bike a lot. I enjoy biking, and so all the bike lanes, I'm a huge fan. But when it comes to parking that it removes and the reduced lanes, it's a pretty controversial issue because people are like, hey, I have a car, I use a car to get where I want to go. Like, you're making my life more difficult. Mm-hmm. And that's a huge issue culturally too, because how much are we like hurting the environmental movement if we're pissing a bunch of people off? And that's the thing. There's like a balance to find of like, we have to put this pressure of pushing people to use more active transport. So whether it be biking, using public transit. Mm-hmm. So we have to have a better infrastructure in place. Montreal has great public transportation infrastructure, and it's only increasing. And so the hope is that over time, people will, instead of buying a new car, maybe they'll shift to public transportation. And so the options need to be there. And Montreal are making the options. They're extending the metro line. They're supposed to add tramways. You can notice it's in some places in Montreal, there used to be trams, and they just paved over them.
Yeah. Sometimes when there's potholes, you can still see them.
Yeah. You can see the old rails coming out through the asphalt. And so the goal is to have those trams working again. And that gives an extra option of like a reliable public transportation. But again, you're asking people to make sacrifices, which is hard to do. And you need to cultivate that culture where people are willing to make those sacrifices. Like there's things about using public transportation that are great, like just not having to worry about driving, not getting stuck in traffic necessarily.
Yeah. I like taking public transit because I'm just on the metro, on the bus. I'm reading. I don't have to be like paying attention to who's about to hit me. On
the
commute.
Yeah, but then there's challenges to that of. I mean, if you take public transit during rush hours, sometimes it's pretty uncomfortable. You're packed with a bunch of other people, and some people would rather just drive. But there's a sector of the population that we could convince to potentially use public transportation instead of being alone in a car. Or even there's a few things, right? You could carpool, super important, and they've done that by having carpool lanes where if you're carpooling, you could go in that lane and cut through the traffic to some extent. So there's ways to encourage that, but it's a longer term change because most people aren't going to sell their car to use public transportation.
Right.
But there is a push to try to convert people from using being alone in a vehicle to either sharing that vehicle with somebody else or
using active transport, public transportation.
But yeah, that's a really challenging thing to do, but they're trying.
Yeah, I feel like part of the logic is you want to make it's almost like it's like that negative reinforcement, right? It's like if you're going to use your car to come downtown, it's going to become harder, right? And so you're less likely. They want to make it less likely that once you do the calculus of like, if I go downtown with my car, but it's going to be hard finding a parking spot, maybe I shouldn't take my car. I feel like is the logic behind that, right? But then, which I think I'm kind of supportive of. Like I drove in today and like I found parking and it was fine. But it's always like, I feel like with that negative reinforcement, right? You need to have other sectors which are being was incentivized, right? And I feel like we're talking about bike lanes. We have so much more bike lanes. It's so much more pleasant to bike around Montreal. It kind of always was, but now it's like you have a whole network of like bike lanes that are guarded,
it's a lot safer,
secure. Yeah, because I mean another big thing was like safety for bikers. And I think on that front, on the biking front, I think it's absolutely something the city has done like just an A+ job of like creating this kind of network of places that people can use active transportation, and people are doing it, right? And that's like something that I think is widely celebrated about the administration's work on that. On the other front, I don't know that the same amount of work has been done on public transportation. I don't know that like to the same degree as they able to do on bike lanes, they've been able to improve on public transportation. Now, of course, I don't think bike lanes and public transportation are starting out at the same spot. I think our public transportation system was already not like advanced, but it was already kind of set up in like the 50s and 60s, and it was set up well. Where I feel like the bike lane stuff was kind of almost not quite starting from scratch, but it was really starting from a much lower floor, right? And they brought that up. I mean, so much of the traffic comes from like off island, right?
Yeah,
off island, and I think that's like the areas where I feel like you don't really see much improvement for public transportation. I mean, you have the REM now, which I think alleviates some of it, but I don't think the REM doesn't have the same capacity or frequency as the metro does. So that's one thing I think. I don't know if the city wants to meet that like really ambitious 25% target. I feel like public transportation must be an area where they sort of pull the resources in. But I feel like the one so far when I've spoken to like municipal politicians or like staffers about this, the argument is always we don't have the money for that, right?
Yeah.
Because like they have the money to do a bike lane, to do however many, it was like 800 million, right, for bike lanes over the last like 8-ish years.
Yeah, a lot of money.
The pink line, just one extra line was supposed to cost like $7 billion, right? So that's, I think, one of the issues that we get into with municipal politics, and I guess just the resources they have access to. But still.
Yeah, well, another thing with public transit, I mean, we saw the province sort of cut funding and put pressure on public transit in Montreal. And there is an avenue where we could be more self-sufficient on public transportation. Somewhere like New York, I think Sidney Ribault in the panel was saying that they are almost 90% self-funded, as in the municipality is funding the metro. I'm not sure what the numbers are for Montreal, but
I think in Montreal it's much lower. It's much lower than that.
Yeah. So there are ways to become more self-sufficient that way, but public transit took a huge hit during the pandemic for multiple reasons. Obviously, when there's a disease going around, a very contagious disease, people are
I don't want to be next to people.
Yeah, you don't want to be next to people. No. So that culturally, I think that put a dent in public transportation. But I think over time, as long as there's no other pandemics, that will hopefully dissipate. But
I want to say, I think there's also a thing about like the culture of being on public transit, right? Where like when we look in places like Asia and like China or Japan, it's like a very common courtesy that if people are sick, sort of sick, or not even sick at all, they still mask, right? So that's something we see at least in like I know Asian countries, and they still use public transit for that. Because I remember when I think when COVID was just starting, I think it was the first reported case I heard, the person took the 24, and that was like, I guess clearly like that's seared in people's minds. That they're like, oh my god, there's like some like invisible contagion on the bus, and I'm going to be on this like crowded bus too.
Yeah, well, I remember sharing when I think it was like March like 18th or something, like a few days after like it really was over in a pandemic. There were like lists online on Montreal like official sites of where people are exposed, and it was all like public transit stuff. So that's a big thing too with the targets that Montreal has set. Like they started in 2020. So when it comes to transportation, like, you obviously you're not gonna. It's a huge challenge to push more people into public transit during a pandemic. So I think that also comes into play as to why the target is so off.
How about a bus that's convertible? So there's like fresh air.
There we go.
That one's free.
Big
that one's free.
That'd be really cool.
I don't think it'd be very loud. I think it'd be also very loud. And
but when you talk about living on the South Shore, and like obviously for you driving in will take 20 minutes, public transiting you're talking about an hour. So that's a huge sacrifice in itself. Especially when you're already spending money on a car, then if you're going to spend money on public transit too, like you're losing in that way too. And so that's a huge argument as to why public transit should be free, because then it doesn't even become part of the equation. You could go at any time when it's if you have more time to take public transit, you would. And then there's
what are you saying about it being free?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's places in Europe where public transit is free, and again, that's a challenge because when there's cuts to public transit budget, like it's much harder to argue for free public transit when they're just trying to maintain.
I feel for me, I feel if there's that 25% target they're trying to hit, it's like we're talking about like sacrifices people take. I feel like one of the sacrifices the government should take is to create a free public transit system, right? Because I feel like you want like in the mind of this like commuter, you want the argument for biking or for public transportation to be so like self-evident. Like, of course I'm gonna bike. There's like a safe bike lane that's beautiful. There's lots of nice cafes around. I get to wear my tight clothes, that's why someone would want to bike. Now
you have to wear your tight clothes?
Yeah, like biking clothes.
Okay.
You just look at me like
I don't know if that's in most people's equations, but
yeah, everyone. No, but then we're looking at like, I mean, imagine like the mind of like someone who's like living on the South Shore. They have the car, or there's like the car that I have to pay for gas, or I take the public transportation, which is going to take a little longer, but completely free.
Yeah. So,
right.
Yeah.
I feel like the argument the city needs to make for public transportation needs to be, they need to make that argument stronger, that case for public transportation stronger. And prices have gone up for like metro tickets, passes. Is like such a complicated like A/B system now, and I think things like that take away from the argument for public transportation.
Yeah, and again, this is all like economics, and I'm no expert in economics. Like there has to, making something like public transit free is a huge challenge. And I didn't see that anywhere in their plans.
No.
But long term, it should be. But another aspect is, of course, densification. So that's a really long term thing. Of the more suburban you are, the more car oriented you are.
Of course, because everything's spread out.
Yeah, and so then obviously public transit's not going to be as appealing because you need to have these buses that are going over huge swaths of land. But then there's other solutions like I have a friend who is an entrepreneur and is working in public transportation, but where buses don't necessarily have fixed routes, but with an application, the bus could come pick you up where you are, and it sort of iteratively on the fly will figure out the best route based on
depending on demand.
On who wants to be there. So there's advancements in that way that could help with, while we try to densify our urban and suburban areas, there are solutions like that. But again, then when we're in the context of like a housing crisis and there's a bunch of other issues on people's minds, like densification becomes a harder thing to push. Like let's just get as many houses out there as possible so that prices of houses go down. Like it's important to look at these issues not just from a climate aspect, but of course holistically, that all these issues are interconnected. So
right.
And I do find that climate change has become less of a priority for a lot of people since the pandemic, just because people are worrying more about their health,
immediate things.
Yeah, immediate things, and like prices, everything have gone up. So that's a huge challenge too, and that's one of the reasons. Sidney Ribault from the Office of Montreal, he said we have to put more pressure on our politicians because this issue has to keep like we have to keep reminding the politicians that this is an important issue to people. And so contacting your local municipal representative for your borough and just sending them a little email or a call of saying, hey, this is an important issue to me. He emphasized that's really important. And I mean, in 2019 we had these huge protests in Montreal.
Yeah, biggest in the world among the climate strikes.
Yeah, and biggest in the world, like 500,000 people. And so that was already 6 years ago, and so that sort of fades the pressure, and after everything that's happened in the past 5 years, but we do have to continue making that push.
Right. You're making that push. You kind of, it sounds like you're adjusting your tactics as a climate activist. Being more pragmatic, having these discussions, having these talks, trying to spur a sense of hope and pragmatism, it seems.
Yeah, because I do think that is the way forward, because people are constantly bogged down by negative news, either in social media, but even news media in general. So, and it's important to look at municipalities and locally for solutions, because there's a lot of progress being done at that level. Mm-hmm. So even when, let's say, the Conservatives get in power in Quebec, in Canada, mm-hmm. Trump in the U.S., federally there could be less progress happening, but mm-hmm. locally there's still that push, and municipal action is super important and powerful. And mm-hmm. Montreal's a great example of that. Like, it's more of a bottom-up approach, and that's the way it should be in a lot of ways, because there's less and less trust for the top-down approach in general, right?
Absolutely. No, thank you for that. Speaking of elections, right now Projet Montréal is having their leadership elections. I'm kind of wondering, like, right now we're not certain who the front. We have some front runners, of course, but it's still I think a month away from the actual elections. But from the next potential Projet Montréal leader, what are qualities and initiatives that you are going to be looking for?
Well, what's great about Projet Montréal is that they're already, like, they're very environmentally focused, and it's just mm-hmm. amazing that they've been elected twice now, mm-hmm. And that Montreal, you could see that Montreal really cares about those issues. Mm-hmm. So to me, like, that's so fundamental to Projet Montréal. So I know some of the front runners are very focused on environmental issues, and that's amazing, and it's really something to look forward to, is that Projet Montréal has a lot of momentum and a lot of mm-hmm. support, but specifically, I mean, just continuing to implement the plans that they've already made. They have plans for climate, they have plans for housing, mm-hmm. and all of them are very impressive. So I think for specific leaders, I don't know enough to really make.
But you want continuity from.
Yeah, which I think is normal to expect mm-hmm. from Projet Montréal. So I'm very supportive of Projet Montréal, and I think they're doing a lot of great things. So
terrific. Well, I think that'll be our episode today. Thank you, Alex, for coming on, talking about eco-anxiety, climate havens. Is Montreal one? Maybe.
Yeah, well,
it can be.
Yeah. We're definitely, geographically, we are in a lot of ways, and the climate action at municipal level really puts us in a good spot mm-hmm. that will be well adapted in the future. Another great example is all the sponge parks that they're doing, because one of the biggest issues here are both the flooding mm-hmm. and the flooding and the
heat islands,
the heat, heat waves, and mm-hmm. so planting a lot of trees. They have huge plans for that, and they've been making great progress mm-hmm. on the
sponge parks. That's sort of like this. It's supposed to help absorb like extra water, right? During high rainfall.
Yeah. Because asphalt doesn't absorb water; it just ends up in the drainage system. Mm-hmm. So reducing the amount of water that ends up in the drainage system will stop areas from overflowing, and they do that by having more areas where the water could actually permeate and go into the water table instead of accumulating on land. So yeah, to me, Montreal is a climate haven.
And the viewer can help make it, right? And the viewer can help make it one as well.
Yeah. Contact your local representative. Tell them that you care about these issues.
Alex Pache, tree scientist, PhD candidate, public scholar. Where can people follow you?
So I'm on LinkedIn, Alexander Pace, or Pache, Pace. I also am on other social medias with my account is Alex Branches Out, and I do some environmental outreach stuff related to tree rings, but environmental stuff in general.
I really like the Alex Branches Out content.
Thank you.
It's been very exciting to follow it. So yeah, give that a follow if you want to hear more from Alex. You want to see more of what he's up to. Thank you for listening. We'll be right back with Hello Goodbye Lines. Talk soon. Welcome back to Metropolis. We have the return of a segment long been dormant. Hello Goodbye Lines are old segment where we bring on our reporters at CUTV to speak a little bit on what they've been reporting on, the pulse of the community. Today, our esteemed guest is CUTV journalist, video journalist, Ode Simo. How are you doing, Ode?
I'm doing good, and you?
I'm doing excellent. Very happy you're on the show. Happy to have Hello Goodbye Lines back up and running. So I'm to understand that you've been doing some reporting, some reconnaissance, information gathering about some protests held by the Sudanese community of Montreal.
Yes.
Can you give a little, what are they protesting about? What's the context to this protest that you went to?
Yeah, so basically on January 26th, I went to a protest organized by the Sudanese Canadian Association of Quebec. It's a protest that was organized, obviously, by Sudanese Montrealers to not only raise awareness about what's currently going on in Sudan, but also just to demand more solidarity from not only the Montreal scene, the Quebec scene, and the Canadian scene, but also internationally. And also to demand action from the government in terms of the program for the reunification of family members, like from Sudan, and family members who are here in Canada.
In Montreal, right,
Yeah.
right. Well, I think it's I'm happy you're reporting on this. Just I feel like it's important to mention. Just at the Super Bowl this Sunday,
Yeah.
there was a protester during the halftime show who lifted up a flag of Sudan and Palestine as well,
Yeah.
and I think was able to broadcast the awareness of that to a very large audience.
Yeah. His name was, I'm going to try and pronounce it, and I'm very sorry for probably butchering it, but his name was Zul Karnain Nantambu, and he actually got a lifetime ban
From the NFL. Yeah, I saw.
For, raising the flags of Palestine and Sudan.
I think worth it.
Yeah, he said himself that honestly he doesn't really mind, because he said, like, I can literally just open my TV and watch the NFL if I want to. Like, this is not going to change shit for me. He said that, like, the main point was really to push for collective liberation, right? Because like the thing is, like, to be able for people to get aware of stuff, like, you have to do it big often. And the NFL, you have like millions of people watching, right?
One of the biggest sporting events in the world,
like across the world, right? So this is something you can't miss. So yeah, he said, like, I really don't care about what, even if this put like a halt to my career, like, I really don't care about that, because the main point is really that people get aware of this. And I think he also has like a company of like, he also has a media company that like focuses on like, marginalized like communities and stuff like that. That's not being talked about in mainstream media. So yeah, incredible. A quick
shout out to him. And I think it's as good time as any to hear what the Sudanese community here in Montreal is trying to struggle towards. Can you give a little context on what's happening in Sudan for viewers who might not know?
So basically right now Sudan is facing the largest displacement crisis in the world. Also one of the largest humanitarian crises, I can pronounce that word and I'm sorry, in the world. So since April 2023, there's a war that broke out in Sudan between the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces. And now it's been 22 months of like warring, and obviously there's been casualties. So civilians have gotten killed. Civilians are fleeing the country, and they're being displaced. There's a lot of internally displaced people. So it's really been it's been a big issue. But unfortunately, since the start of the war, there hasn't been that many coverage. There used to be a lot of coverage in the first 2 months when there was foreigners and diplomats in Sudan. But since they've been evacuated, the people there's not been as much coverage.
Right. So people were, I guess media was only concerned about the internationals there, right?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen it also like in other like issues there, right? Yeah. Especially like, I think this is a very interesting point that one of the people we've had on the show, Doha El Madi, has been on the show in November 2024. When I talked to her as well during an interview last year, she mentioned that obviously anti-blackness has a lot to do with this, which I agree with. as a black person, because you see the difference in treatment. You know, like when we've seen it, when we saw what happened in Ukraine as well. You know, a lot of black people living in Ukraine were left behind.
Right.
You know, and also like one thing that a lot of black people have been talking about, and I'm diverging from the topic, but like I just want to get this point across, is that, you know, like stuff is going on in Haiti, Tigray, you know, the Congo, you know, Sudan, as we talked about. There's many different countries in Africa, but also like Afro-descendant countries that have been going through a lot of political unrest. And it's like people don't really talk about it, and it's almost like they assume that this is just the standard of like how
Right.
things are going in like black countries, basically.
Right.
So it's a big issue, right? People are
That stuff is sort of, the unrest there is expected out of these kinds
Yeah,
of
they're
countries,
like,
is the
you know, like-
incorrect assumption that some people have, I guess.
like we've learned about, for example, rebels like in high schools and stuff like that. It's always like, oh, there's rebels in Africa, or even like the publicities we've seen, not publicity, but ads we've seen about like, you know, everyone in Africa is going through famine, right? Like you had the images of children like basically begging for-
like the old
yeah.
infomercial.
Yeah, exactly.
With like some well-to-do white person who's like, here's
Yeah,
how you can
yeah,
help
and then
this
they're like
child.
begging for water, right?
Yeah,
They're like,
yeah,
give me water, please. You know, I'm dying.
It
So-
creates a specific kind of
Yeah, exactly. So people are just
imagery.
kind of accepting, and this is what Toha was talking about in terms of like what's going on in Sudan. People are not really looking at what's going on because they kind of just assume that this is like the standard of life for people in Africa or black countries.
Right.
So this is also one thing that the Sudanese Association, Canadian Association of Quebec, has been trying to bring on during their protest in January, is that, yeah, people need to keep their eyes on Sudan and talk about Sudan and discuss what's going on in Sudan, and they cannot forget about people in other countries, especially since like there's a large Sudanese community in Montreal. So it's just kind of unfair that they're doing most of the lifting and fighting for their own people, you know, like it doesn't just because it
they don't
doesn't
have the
affect
same
you.
supports that
Yeah.
other populations might.
Yeah, exactly, and that's very, very sad to
It's
see.
a clear bias, yeah.
Yeah,
Like you're
yeah.
saying, anti-black bias.
Yeah.
I remember when the Ukraine war started. This kind of reminds me, not to, I'll make this quick, but this kind of reminds me of when the war started in Ukraine. I remember, I think it was like Prince Charles who had that, or Prince Harry who had that. No, it was Charles. It was one of the royals who had the statement of like, wow, like this is happening in Europe. This kind of stuff doesn't happen here.
Yeah, exactly.
You know?
But even like on the news, I think too as well, somebody said like, I think a news reporter also said the same thing, saying like, this is something you would expect from Africa, but not
Oh my
Europe.
God.
Yeah,
Really?
I'm pretty sure. I'm
Oh
like, I
my
think I could find a quote, but like we'll find.
I mean,
it
there's
at
so
the
much
time.
to unpack. there.
Yeah.
That kind of like bias.
Yeah.
Anyways, that's maybe another episode, maybe after
Yeah,
this
it's
one.
a-
But so you're saying, I interrupted you, but you're saying that this got some coverage at the start of the war, the first 2 months.
Yeah.
But then once the foreign nationals, once the diplomats were sort of out, the attention for it decreased, and maybe that's partly the reason that Sudanese Montrealers are out in the streets.
Yeah, exactly. Because the situation is getting more and more worrisome, obviously. You know, a lot of sexual violence towards children and women, men too, obviously, but specifically women and children. You know, the healthcare system is on the brink of, you know, falling apart, if it's not already from the last research I've done. The education system, like it's all like makeshift now. It's all makeshift, like a makeshift healthcare system, makeshift education system as well.
Right. There's no stability.
Yeah, there's no stability, and 24 million people are facing acute famine.
24 million.
So yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot. It's been, it's very much like underreported, and people are very much like, you know, going through one of the worst humanitarian crises, as we've talked about. Yeah. But yeah, I do think that one very important point, though, that was brought up during the protest that I went to is that the bringing of family members from Sudan to Canada. This has not really, it was supposed to be done, but it hasn't really been done. So at the protest, they talked about how the IRCC, so the Immigration and Refugees Citizenship Canada Department of the government has promised to help Sudanese families come to Canada, but hasn't done anything. So the Sudanese community in Montreal is obviously very frustrated by this, but it's also that like their Sudanese family members cannot come to Quebec. Quebec has opted out of the program to bring Sudanese people here in Canada. So they're not accepted in Quebec. So Montreal either. But as I said earlier, like there's a big Sudanese community here in Montreal. So it's kind of like, imagine like, you're living here and then you can't even bring your family to come see you. They have to go somewhere else in the country, somewhere where they don't have any family members, where they don't know anyone, where they don't know the way of life and everything. So it's very like unsettling, right? And obviously like, you want to be with family, but it would be you would have to uproot your entire life to also go live in another province in Quebec, in Canada, to be able to be with family.
Right.
So it's big things, and the thing is, even then, those family members also cannot come on their own because right now with the war they don't make an income. They don't have money, right? Well, they don't have money, but I mean like they cannot make money because the system is kind of collapsed, right?
Yeah.
So
they're
it's
just most of them are on a survival basis.
Yeah, exactly. So they've been asking for help from the IRCC, but the IRCC has not been delivering. Their program actually started back in February 2024, which is once again 1 year after the war started. So that's already there. Like the number of people who died from April 2023 to February 2024 is already immense. But then, as I said, the program started in February 2024, and I think it was 7,300 applications that were supposed to go through. And it's September 2024. No application had gone through.
Out of the 7,000 or so?
Not yet. They were not. Like, they were still, like...
From February to September.
And nobody, obviously, had been able to come to Montreal. Well, not Montreal, but come to Canada.
Right.
And even less so Montreal and Quebec because of it. And then I'm just going to read the numbers here because I want to make sure I, get them, like, present them well. But yeah, so applications were no longer accepted after the 7,300 people. But then from February to September, nobody had arrived to Canada yet. And obviously many died while waiting for their application to be approved, which is something that we've seen also with Palestine. I remember Samar, for example, who her daughter died while waiting for her visa to get approved. And obviously she got the approval months after she died. So, so it's a
cruel and slow system.
It's a very, very similar issue. But yeah, there was supposed to be a reopening in November 2024, but it was delayed.
A reopening of what?
Of the program for people to be able to come to Canada through the program of the IRCC, but it was delayed. And then they said that they were going to do it again in January. January arrived, January 2025 arrived, it was delayed once again, it was postponed, and then it was supposed to be in February. On February 4th, they were supposed to get news, but it was once again delayed.
We're talking about this month?
Yeah, this month,
wow.
Delayed. So it hasn't been nobody has been able to come here. No action has been, there's no action that's been done, to be honest. And also, even I think the cap has lessened as well, if I'm not mistaken, because I saw, as I said, I saw a report that said 7,300 people were able to apply. But in another report from the Sudanese Canadian Association of Quebec, it says that only actually 3,000 people were able to apply to come here. But how can you put a cap of 3,000 people for people who are fleeing war and different crises like food, water, healthcare system, education, right? 3,000 people is nothing. We already have between 150,000 people and 500,000 people who have died. The numbers are not clear. It depends from source to source, but obviously,
of course, yeah. So in wartime, it's usually difficult to get a solid number. But so
3,000 people out of all the people who've died already, that's nothing. That's just for 15 million people have been displaced. What is 3,000 out of all of this, right?
Right. Even 7,000 is
it's nothing.
That, they reduced it even more.
Yeah, that's actually quite it's quite shocking to see. It's not surprising, but it's quite shocking to see. So they've been asking, so the Sudanese Canadian Association of Quebec, the one that organized the protest in January, are asking that there's no, for the cap to be lifted, because once again, we're talking about saving lives here, but they're also asking that the Quebec government decide to partake in the program, because it's very unfair for considering the Sudanese community in Montreal, but just in Quebec in general, who have been, giving to society, obviously. So like you can't really, keep them from seeing their family. But when the Quebec government was asked about this, I'm just gonna find the quote, but when they were asked about this, they said, the Quebec's Ministry of Immigration, they said that the province contributes to the humanitarian effort by welcoming a large proportion of asylum seekers in Canada, and that's all they had to say.
Wow.
But in Canada, first of all, it's not Quebec. That doesn't mean Quebec, right?
Yeah.
And also, like, the issue is like, what are you specifically doing? That's
it's so like
it's just like, oh yeah, we're doing
redirects.
Yeah, exactly. We're doing our
There's
part.
no accountability.
Bring it up to Canada.
Yeah.
Like we're doing what we
Yeah.
can. So that's also quite, distressing.
Yeah, frustrating.
Yeah, exactly.
I would imagine.
Yeah,
very frustrating
yeah.
for these Sudanese families who are worried about their family's safety.
Yeah, you don't know if they're still alive.
Yeah.
It's already hard to get news as well and everything. So it's like, and then you have to be the person as well here, raising the money for your family as well, to be able to support them, to have them come to Canada. But then every time they're trying to come to Canada, like, there's always a delay. They're not being accepted. And it's not even that. They also talked about how there's no support for Sudanese people to come to Canada as well. Like, no support in how to apply, no support, no financial support, no biometric systems to also make the applications easier. So it's like it's a process that's very, very hard. And like, I know that Doha, specifically in interviews, and also the association, as I was talking about, brought up that this was not the case for, Haiti. It was not the case for Ukraine. I think it was Bolivia as well, or not Colombia. Like many countries who actually needed assistance in bringing close ones here in Canada, Montreal or Quebec, were able to do so with assistance from the government. But for Sudanese people, there's no assistance whatsoever, no financial support, no application support as well. And it's very, it's very, you wonder why it's happening. And I know that like the IRCC, or maybe like, I think it's the IRCC, they responded that the reason why it's like you cannot compare the situation of Sudanese people to the situation of like Ukraine, for example, because they were like, these are very different, these are very different like issues, but also, sorry, I lost my train of thought, but but also, Ukraine was for temporary residents, while Sudan is for some of the people applying, it's permanent.
Right.
So they cannot give the same support, which, I don't think it makes sense, because even if you can give them support forever, you can still kind of kickstart support from the transition to Sudan to Canada. It doesn't mean just because it's not the same thing doesn't mean you have to go. It's not all in or nothing, right?
Of course, yeah.
So that
there's
doesn't
a whole spectrum of support you can give.
You can give a sort of support, just something, a push to help them, like a little step. It doesn't mean that suddenly like, oh well, it's not the same thing, so I cannot give you any type of support. If it was different, then maybe I would. But yeah, it's been a big issue. It's really awful to see how especially since Canada, Quebec even, they pride themselves as a province and a country that is so for like people working together for acceptance of the other, stuff like that. And then like every time there's an issue like that, you see that where's the support? Yeah, exactly. Where's the support you said that you had for other people, right? And they keep on denying that there's like racism or any type of discrimination against other people, right? And that we're a very progressive province, a very progressive country, but then where's the work? So no offense. Well, actually, yes, offense, but I don't want to. No, because I don't want to be. I don't want to get Legault come after me or like whoever else.
Sure.
So it's but to be back to that, it's very disheartening to see.
Yeah, it's kind of like like the timing of it is like tough because this is especially. Like we've talked about this on the show before, but like this is a time where like even the Liberal Party, who used to pride themselves on like we're going to accept 100,000 immigrants, we're going to accept refugees. That's kind of like a whole part of the identity. Well, now even they're turning their back on this, and it sounds like on that kind of like positioning. And now it sounds like even like for things like refugees, like fleeing like a war-torn country, that they're even turning their backs on them as well.
Yeah, but even recently, I remember seeing something from Legault, like. I remember when like there was when the news of Amazon leaving Quebec broke out, and then obviously Legault made his joke about orange juice and Canadien de Montréal.
What was the joke?
Like somebody asked, a reporter asked like to Legault like, hey, what's your opinion on like what's going on with Amazon? And then Legault very much interrupted the person and said like, first off, les Canadiens ont gagné hier soir. Something like that. Sure. And then he was like, puis deux, while the person was trying to speak, he was like, deux, like speaking over the person, which was, it's not funny, but it was kind of funny. Deux, j'ai pas eu d'orange ce matin, before correcting himself. I said, j'ai pas bu de jus d'orange ce matin. And then he left. So it was like, okay.
He's trying to be like, no Florida oranges for me, kind of thing.
Yeah, but, sorry.
What about that made you?
After that, like he had a press conference where he talked about Amazon, but also like at the same time he also discussed other issues in Quebec, and one of them was like about immigrants. I have the notes somewhere. I need to find them, but if I remember correctly, he was like, we don't want another Roxham Road, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And at first I thought that maybe like, is this something that like, I mean, we've known that Legault has had very, anti-immigrant series. But I was like, maybe like he's trying to say like, we don't want to make sure people die, because like Roxham Road has been known to like, people while crossing Roxham Road have died, right? Mm-hmm. There's been a lot of people freezing to death, or just people not being able to find where they're going. So I thought maybe he was going to bring attention to that. But what he said was just like, he just doesn't want a bunch of immigrants to come to Canada and like have to like find a way. He said like, we cannot accept immigrants anymore, like there's too many, right? But how does that make sense? Because so many people can come to can come on a trip here, can come on a visa here and stay forever. So basically he just doesn't want like
a certain kind of immigrant, I guess.
Exactly. Because it just doesn't make sense with what you're accepting, right? Mm-hmm. So again, so it made me think of that as well, like Legault's like they just don't want people certain people to come here.
Mm-hmm. It's a shame because they have cases like this where people need the help, want the safety, and
we're talking about
our politicians are completely turning a blind eye to that.
We're talking about a war. We're talking about like, we're not talking about just like, well, even then, like, again, like, who are you to decide who can come into a country and who cannot, right? Mm-hmm. But people are fleeing war, fleeing like getting like sexually assaulted, losing their family members, famine. They're trying to save their own lives and be able to live, right?
On such a massive scale, right? This is kind of violence on like that. Like most people, I won't say most people in Canada don't know that kind of level of violence, right? That displaces in like a whole country, that creates this kind of crisis.
Most people have no idea what's that like.
I mean, I know I don't, but I would hope. I don't know. Maybe it's me being idealistic, but I feel like we should be able to put a hand out and like help these people, and doesn't sound like our politicians are really up for the task.
It's very, again, like annoying to see that most of the time it's the actual diaspora that has to support their own, like obviously you're gonna support your own like community, but I mean like people outside of it should be able to, like, there should be inter-community like solidarity. Like, just because you're not part of this community doesn't mean that you have to be like, I don't care, it's not my problem. Because that's a big problem as well that we've seen with also like Palestine and even like Haiti and Tigray, I can never pronounce this right, I'm sorry, where people distance themselves from the issue because they're like, well, I don't live there, I don't know anyone there, and it seems so far off from there for them, right? So they just like, they're like, well, especially with like now with like how we use like social media as well, I don't know, just kind of like really like like kind of a wall that's there, like very much like a distance that's created. So that's very
It's tough. It's tough to build solidarity out of that kind of stuff, especially when people fit into those kind of like. I mean, people lock themselves away in those kinds of identity silos, right? Where like, oh, this is who I am, and whoever I am that's the kind of person I want to help. Or I want like, but like, it's like I find that so like insular, and it kind of like creates just more isolation, right?
Yeah.
Where it sounds like what's needed is solidarity, even just on like there's like a human level, right? Just like, just. Another human being needs help, so we should be able to help them.
Yeah, I'm honestly really hoping that what I think Zul did, the person who had the flag that said Sudan, Palestine, at the Super Bowl, is going to bring more attention to the cause for sure. Because even then, like, once again, like, I've gone to many, sorry, my stomach is growling, but I've gone to many protests for Sudan. And a lot of the time unfortunately, I don't see a lot of people. I see maybe 50 people and such, which is it's a letdown, obviously, because it's like,
the awareness isn't there.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, although they do, like, even the group that I talked to you about, the association, they do mobilize every 2 weeks in Montreal. Every 2 weeks they go to the same space, bring the same signs, do the speech again and again to bring awareness. And yet, it was nice though, because last time I went, some people did stop to ask questions about what was going on, which is great. In January. So that was really, really good. But yeah, in general, like, I don't know. Oops, sorry, I keep. But people, people don't seem to care, unfortunately.
It's like an uphill battle for them.
It's annoying to see how people don't care about Black lives, but lives in general, but especially non-white lives.
Of course, yeah.
And
there's
then
that bias that's there.
Yeah, put into consideration anti-Blackness, and you gotta,
a whole issue.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Old, for coming on talking about this.
Yeah, no problem.
This was Old Simon, CUTV journalist, talking about actions that the Sudanese community here in Montreal are taking to bring in some solidarity and try to reunite some of their families. Thank you very much, Old.
Thank you.
And thank you, listener, for listening to Metropolis. This was Hello Goodbye Lines, a segment of Metropolis. Tune in next time for more in-depth conversations and discussions about things affecting Montrealers. Take care.